Widow takes in an elderly teacher, lost in the storm, until she discovers a hidden secret. Comment below, telling me what you thought of this story, giving it a score from 0 to 10, and let me know what city you are watching me from. I really want to know if you liked my story, and I want to get to know you better. So please subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The night rolled in heavy, the way it only does out here on the prairie when a storm is brewing from miles away. I was in the kitchen, my hands covered in bread dough, when I heard the first knocks on the door. They weren't normal knocks. They were weak, spaced-out thumps, as if whoever was knocking had no strength left. I've been living alone for 2 years. In all that time, I've learned that silence isn't the absence of noise. It's a weight. It's the sound of a house that's too big, of the rooms I avoid opening, of the chairs no one pulls out anymore. I also learned that loneliness doesn't hurt the way people think it does. It doesn't cry. It just sits there right beside you every single day, waiting for you to get used to it. But that night, when I opened the door and saw that soaking wet woman, her fogged-up glasses dripping water, her leather purse clutched to her chest, as if she held her entire life in there, something inside me woke up. I don't know if it was pity. I don't know if it was the fear of seeing myself reflected in her a few years down the line. All I know is that I couldn't close the door. "Please," she said, her voice coming out weak, almost swallowed by the sound of the rain beating against the tin roof. I got lost. I just need one night. I hesitated. Of course I hesitated. A woman living alone doesn't open her door to strangers, especially at night, especially in the middle of nowhere. But a crack of thunder shook the windows right then, and the decision was made for me. "Come in," I said. Her name was Margaret. In her early 70s, white hair tied in a bun that the rain had ruined, her clothes clinging to her frail frame. She said she was a retired teacher. She said she was on her way to visit a former student and got lost when the storm broke. She said she had a nephew who would come pick her up as soon as the roads cleared. I brought her some towels, warmed up some coffee. I offered her the guest bedroom, the one at the back of the house that I only opened to air out the mustiness. She thanked me with an old-fashioned politeness, the kind anymore. We didn't talk much that first night. I'm not much of a talker, and she seemed too exhausted to even fake an interest. I thought it would be just one night. It should have been just one night. But the storm didn't pass. It kept raining for 3 straight days, the kind of downpour that turns dirt roads into rivers of thick mud and completely isolates you from the world. Margaret stayed, and I, someone who went entire weeks without seeing a single soul, suddenly had company. At first, it was actually nice. She told stories from her classroom days, from a time when teachers were still respected, about those students you never forget. I listened while I mended clothes, while I tended to my garden during breaks in the rain, while I cooked lunch. It was strange hearing a voice in the house that wasn't my own, but it was a comforting kind of strange, except there was something off, too subtle for me to pinpoint at first, but it was there. Margaret asked questions that were a little too pointed. "Has this cabinet always been here, Sarah? Where did your husband keep the property deeds? Do you have relatives who come visit often?" I answered without thinking much of it. After all, older folks are curious. They like to get a feel for where they are. It's no big deal. But when the rain finally stopped and she didn't leave, I started paying closer attention. There was always a new excuse. Her nephew's car broke down. The roads were still too washed out. A dizzy spell she woke up with that made traveling too risky. I went along with it because I'm not one to turn away someone in need, because I know what it's like to need someone and have no one there, because deep down, I think a part of me didn't want her to leave just yet. Emily was the first one to notice. Emily lives about 2 miles away, just on the other side of the cornfield. She has a habit of taking early morning walks, always taking the same route, passing by here every week. That Thursday, she knocked on the door and asked for a glass of water, like she always does. But when I brought her the glass, she had this strange look on her face. "Sarah, who is that woman I saw walking around your property earlier?" she asked, keeping her voice low, as if she didn't want anyone to hear. "Margaret. She's a guest. Got lost in the storm." "She was pacing out the perimeter of the house," Emily said, and the way she said it made my stomach drop. "Like a land surveyor does. I saw her, Sarah. She wasn't just taking a stroll, she was measuring distances." I laughed. I laughed because the alternative was letting the fear in, and I couldn't afford to do that. "You must be seeing things, Emily. Margaret is just a lost old lady." But that night, alone in my bedroom, I couldn't stop thinking about it. 2 days later, my niece Chloe called. She lives in the city, works with the internet, tech stuff I don't fully understand. She said she had looked up the name Margaret Miller, retired teacher, and found absolutely nothing. No school affiliations, no retirement records. The name existed, sure, but the person Margaret claimed to be was nowhere to be found. "Auntie, I don't want to scare you," Chloe said, her voice dead serious. "But you need to be careful. That woman isn't who she says she is." I hung up the phone, my hand trembling. I stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the guest bedroom door down the hall, wondering exactly what I had let into my home. I started watching Margaret differently, and the more I watched her, the less things made sense. She knew things I had never told her. She knew the well was 80 yards from the house, right behind the old barn. She knew my late husband had a business partner named Arthur before he passed away. When I asked her how she knew that, she just gave me that polite smile and changed the subject with a smoothness that turned my blood cold. At night, I couldn't sleep. The damp heat from the fields crept in through the cracks in the windows, and every little noise felt like a threat. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened since she showed up. And it was during those sleepless nights that the pieces finally started clicking into place. That leather purse she never let out of her sight. The early morning walks Emily had witnessed. The probing questions about property deeds. The endless excuses for sticking around. Margaret wasn't lost. Margaret was on the clock. And on Friday morning, when she stepped out onto the porch to catch some sun, I slipped into her room. My heart was pounding so hard it physically hurt. I knew it was wrong. I knew I was invading her privacy. But I had to know. Her purse was sitting on the bed, slightly unzipped. Inside, tucked between a cloth handkerchief and a bottle of blood pressure pills, was a folded piece of paper. I opened it. It was a map of my property. Hand-drawn, with precise measurements jotted down in the margins, the location of the well, the layout of the house, the exact property lines, and in the top corner, written in neat, tiny handwriting, "Report for Richard Vance, Phase 1, complete." The floor seemed to vanish right out from under me. Richard. I knew that name all too well. Richard Vance, a corporate agriculture tycoon who owned half the farmland in the county. The man who had tried to buy this land 3 different times while my husband was still alive. The man who started circling again after I was left alone, coming at me with offers that grew more insistent, more threateningly polite each time. And now he had planted someone right inside my home. Margaret wasn't some lost old lady. She was a corporate spy. I shoved the paper back, zipped up the purse exactly as I'd found it, and stumbled out of the room on shaky legs. When I walked back into the kitchen, Margaret was sitting at the table, smiling up at me as if nothing in the world was wrong. "Good morning, Sarah," she chirped, in that sickeningly sweet, retired teacher voice. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I forced a smile. "Sure is." But on the inside, I was screaming. I played dumb for the next 3 days. I'd wake up, brew the coffee, chat with Margaret about the weather, the upcoming harvest, about absolutely nothing of substance. but every single word that left my mouth was calculated. Every movement was carefully measured. I was terrified she'd figure out I was onto her. At night, once she retired to her room, I'd call Chloe, whispering into the living room phone as if the very walls were eavesdropping. I told her everything. The map, Richard's name, the pacing measurements. Chloe went dead silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Auntie, you need to get that woman out of your house right now," she said, and her voice sounded different, genuinely frightened. "And how exactly do I do that? She's not going to just pack up and leave. And if I force her out, Richard will know I've caught on. Then we need to get help." That's when Rachel entered the picture. Rachel was the lawyer my husband used for all our affairs, a no-nonsense, straight-shooting woman who never backed down from a fight. Chloe called her, explained the whole mess. Rachel promised to look into it. 2 days later, she called me back. And what she told me made my world completely collapse all over again. "Sarah, there's an issue with your property deeds." I felt my blood run cold. "What kind of issue?" "An old discrepancy in the original land registry. Someone planted it there years ago. And if Richard Vance finds out about it, he can legally challenge your ownership. You could lose everything without him lifting a finger, just by dragging you to court." I was speechless, completely struck dumb. Rachel kept talking, throwing around legal jargon I couldn't follow, but the bottom line was crystal clear. I had survived 2 years alone on this land, firmly believing it was mine by right. And now I was finding out I was standing on a legal landmine. "Is there a way to fix it?" I managed to choke out. "There is, but it's going to take time, and we're going to need Arthur to testify." Arthur, my late husband's old business partner, the man who vanished from our lives after my husband passed, living like a hermit on the other side of the county, wanting absolutely nothing to do with this property ever again. "He's never going to agree to that," I said. "Then you're going to have to convince him." I hung up the phone, feeling the crushing weight of it all. Margaret was still festering in my house, mapping every square inch. Richard was lurking out there, orchestrating a scheme I could barely wrap my head around. And now I was discovering that the very land I had fought so hard to keep might never have truly belonged to me. It was that very night that I met David. I had gone out for a walk. I needed some fresh air. I needed to clear my head far away from Margaret's suffocating presence. I walked down to the local general store, a tiny place that closes up early, just to remind myself that a world still existed outside that house. I was standing in the checkout line when a man approached me, tall in his late 50s, close-cropped gray hair, with a very serious demeanor. "Sarah Vance?" he asked, his tone way too direct to be just a casual greeting. My entire body tensed up. "Who's asking?" "My name is David. I live a few miles over, and you're being watched." My stomach churned. "How do you know my name?" "Because I've been watching too, only I happen to be on your side." I stared at him, completely lost. He kept going, his voice low and steady, leaving no room for doubt. "I've seen Richard's truck parked on the access road to your property 3 times now, always at night, always at the exact same hour. He's setting something up and you're caught right in the crosshairs." "Who exactly are you?" I demanded, my suspicion loud and clear. "I used to be the county sheriff. They pushed me out into early retirement because I blew the whistle on the wrong people. Now I just tend to my own acreage and patrol the back roads. Old habits die hard." He paused. "Your neighbor Emily came to see me. She said you were in some trouble. I came to see if I could lend a hand." I don't know why, but I believed him. Maybe it was sheer exhaustion. Maybe because I literally had no one else. Maybe because deep down, I desperately needed to believe there were still folks out there willing to help without wanting a piece of me in return. I spilled everything. Margaret, the hidden map, Richard Vance, the messed up deeds. David listened without interrupting once, and when I finally finished, he gave a slow nod. You did the right thing by not tipping your hand to the woman just yet, but you need to flush her out before Richard makes his next move. Leave that to me. I didn't argue. I walked back home harboring a tiny shred of hope I hadn't felt in days. But when I got back, Buster, my dog, wasn't in his usual spot. Buster was a grizzled old mutt my husband had brought home years ago, and he patrolled the property line every single day, like he was getting paid for it. He never wandered off. I called out for him. Nothing. I called again, sweeping the yard with my flashlight, my heart hammering faster by the minute. It was almost midnight when I finally found him, slumped against the back fence, his front paw bleeding and his coat caked in dirt. I scooped him up, carried him inside, and cleaned the wound while he let out soft little whimpers. His paw had a nasty gash, like he had thrown himself against something sharp, or someone. I spent the entire night wide awake, sitting on the cold kitchen floor, cradling Buster, crying for him, and for my late husband, and for everything that felt like it was being brutally ripped away from me piece by piece. And it was right there in the dead of night that I made my choice. I was going to trust David. I was out of options. The very next day, David showed up. He brought another man with him, Thomas, a county clerk from the next town over. Rachel, the lawyer, was there too. We hammered out a war plan right at my kitchen table, while Margaret was down the hall pretending to be fast asleep. Rachel laid it out. We had to correct those deeds before Richard Vance could file his lawsuit. Thomas said he could process the amendment, but that Richard had deep pockets and deep influence at our local clerk's office. We had to beat him to the punch. What about Arthur? I asked. Without him, there's no way to prove the discrepancy was just a clerical error and not outright fraud. I'll ride with you, David chimed in. We'll go pay him a visit tomorrow. That night, two men showed up on my front porch. They knocked with a sickeningly fake politeness, flashing smiles that were way too wide. They said they were there on behalf of Richard Vance, said he wanted to make a friendly, generous offer on the land, said it would be the smartest move for everyone involved. One introduced himself as Vince, the other as Tyler. They just stood there, crowding the doorway, preaching about what was best for the community, about how maintaining an isolated farm was just too much back-breaking work for a woman living all alone, about how it would be much safer for my well-being if I just took the payout. They weren't making direct threats. They were handing me threats wrapped up in a pretty bow. Once they finally drove off, I deadbolted the door and slumped against it, shaking like a leaf. Margaret shuffled into the living room, wearing that mask of fake matronly concern. Is everything all right, Sarah? I stared right at her, at the woman who had wormed her way into my home disguised as someone else, at Richard's corporate spy. And for the very first time, I couldn't keep the act up. Get out of my house. She blinked, feigning shock. Excuse me? I know exactly who you are. I know exactly who's paying you, and I want you off my property by sunrise. Her entire face shifted. The sweet old teacher mask completely slipped off, revealing a cold, calculating professional. She didn't say a single word. She just turned on her heel and marched back to her room. By the time the sun came up, she was gone. No goodbyes, no explanations. She just vanished into thin air, taking her leather purse and leaving the bed meticulously made, as if she had never even been there. But the fear didn't leave with her, because Richard was still out there. And now he knew that I was onto him. David rolled up early. We drove out to Arthur's place, on the far outskirts of the county, in a quiet, reclusive neighborhood where every house had tall iron fences and guard dogs that barked at the wind. Arthur cracked the door open an inch, looking highly suspicious. I laid it all out for him. The deed discrepancy, Richard Vance, the very real risk of losing the farm entirely. He stood there in silence for so long, I was sure he was going to slam the door in my face. But then he let out a heavy, defeated sigh. I always knew this would come back to haunt us, he rasped, looking utterly exhausted. It was my own sloppy mistake, Sarah. A careless error I've carried on my conscience all these years. I'll testify. I'll make it right. I walked away from his porch, feeling like a ton of bricks had been lifted off my chest. But David gave me a grim warning on the drive back. Richard wasn't going to just sit back and let this happen. And he didn't. 3 days later, David pulled into my driveway, sporting a heavily bandaged arm and a nasty bruise across his cheekbone. They had boxed his truck in on a lonely back road. They didn't put him in the hospital. They just delivered a very clear message: back off. But David didn't back off, and neither did I. Arthur's sworn deposition took place on a Tuesday morning at the county clerk's office in the neighboring town. Thomas had managed to schedule it quietly, under the radar, bypassing our local office where Richard had everyone in his pocket. The room was cramped, furnished with a scarred wooden table and a rattling ceiling fan that barely pushed the stale air around. Arthur was a nervous wreck. I could see it in the white-knuckle grip he had on his pen, the way his fingers shook uncontrollably before signing every single page. Rachel, the lawyer, steered the whole process with a bulldog intensity that managed to keep me somewhat grounded. She hammered him with the right questions, recorded every answer meticulously, and organized the amended deeds with absolute surgical precision. "Do you swear on the record that the discrepancy in the land registry was strictly the result of a clerical filing error during the transfer of ownership and not a deliberate attempt at real estate fraud?" Rachel demanded. "I swear it," Arthur replied, his voice finding its footing for the first time that morning. "It was my own reckless oversight. I was rushing things back then, juggling 3 different properties all at once. I didn't proofread the paperwork before filing it with the county. By the time I caught the mistake, years had passed, and I stupidly thought it was better to just let sleeping dogs lie. And why did you never file an amendment to fix it?" Arthur turned to look at me, dead in the eye. "Because I was a coward. I was terrified it would cause legal trouble for the family, terrified that some shark would find it and use it to bleed them dry." He hung his head in shame. "And now it's happening anyway." We signed every dotted line. Thomas notarized the stack of papers and swore the corrected registry would be pushed through the system by the end of the week. But right before we walked out the door, he pulled me aside. "Sarah, Richard has eyes peering out of every crack in this county. He's going to find out you were here today. You need to brace yourself." "Brace myself for what?" "For him to stop playing nice and escalate things." We headed back to the farm with David behind the wheel, driving at a crawl, his eyes locked on every passing truck, scanning every blind curve on the highway. His arm was still heavily wrapped, but he never uttered a single complaint. He just drove, hyper-focused, like a man waiting for an ambush. "You didn't have to put yourself on the line like this," I murmured, eyeing his bandaged arm. "Yeah, I did." "Why? You didn't even know I existed until last week." He chewed on that in silence for a few miles. Then he finally spoke up, without ever taking his eyes off the pavement. "Because there are decent folks in this world who deserve a fighting chance. And there are ruthless bastards who deserve to be put in the dirt. It's as simple as that." It wasn't simple. Not a single damn thing about this was simple. But I didn't argue. When we pulled up to the house, Emily was pacing by the front gate. All the color had drained from her face, and she had a death grip on her cell phone. "Sarah, there's a guy down at the general store asking all sorts of questions about you, spreading rumors that you're causing major headaches for a prominent local businessman, telling everyone you're unhinged and making up crazy stories." My stomach tied itself into a knot. "Who is he?" "I have no idea, but he was holding court when I left, making sure his voice carried so every single person in the aisles could hear him." Richard was taking off the gloves. The legal extortion wasn't enough. The back alley intimidation wasn't enough. Now he was trying to torch my reputation, painting me as a local nuisance to isolate me from my own neighbors. David climbed out of the truck slowly, calculating the angles. He's trying to cut you from the herd. Make sure that when the hammer finally drops, not a single soul in this town will lift a finger to help you. Is it going to work? Only if you fold and let him win. Over the next few days, I felt the noose tightening. People down at the store started looking at me sideways. Some would completely avoid eye contact when I walked down the aisle. Others would lean in and whisper. Nobody had the guts to say anything to my face, but the message was crystal clear. I had officially become radioactive. Chloe called me every single day, begging to know if I was safe, if I needed cash, pleading with me to pack a bag and stay at her apartment in the city until the heat died down. I shot her down every time, because running away meant throwing in the towel. It meant handing Richard a victory without making him bleed for it, and there was no way in hell I was going to do that. Things finally reached a boiling point on a Thursday night. I was just finishing up dinner when Buster started going absolutely crazy in the yard. It wasn't his usual warning bark. It was a frantic, terrified howling. I bolted out the back door and saw 3 massive silhouettes standing deep inside my property line, lurking by the old tractor shed. My heart felt like it was going to pound out of my ribs. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and marched out there, screaming at the top of my lungs. "Get the hell off my land! You're trespassing!" One of the shadows chuckled. It wasn't a menacing movie villain laugh. It was so much worse. It was the laugh of a man who viewed me as a pathetic joke. "We're just doing a routine survey, ma'am. No need to get hysterical." "Surveying what? You have absolutely zero legal right to be here." All right, we're leaving. But you really ought to sit down and reconsider some of your recent life choices, lady. It's highly recommended for your long-term health." They strolled off at a leisurely pace, completely unbothered, moving like men who owned the ground they walked on and knew they could return whenever they pleased. Buster didn't stop snarling until their taillights vanished down the pitch-black road. I stumbled back inside, shaking with a furious kind of adrenaline. I immediately dialed David. He pulled into the driveway 20 minutes later. "They're just testing the fences," he stated grimly after I gave him the rundown, "prodding you to see exactly how much pressure it takes before you completely crack." "And what if I do crack?" "You won't." "How can you be so damn sure?" He looked me up and down, and for the very first time, I saw a glimmer of genuine respect in his eyes. He looked me up and down, and for the very first time, I saw a glimmer of genuine respect in his eyes. "Because life has thrown much worse at you, and you're still standing your ground." 2 days later, Rachel called with an urgent update. She had managed to hack through the red tape at the corrupt local clerk's office, and what she found changed the entire landscape of the war. "Sarah, Richard has officially filed a lawsuit challenging your legal ownership. He's arguing that the original deed discrepancy completely invalidates your right to the property." My entire world tilted on its axis. "But we literally just fixed that. Arthur went on the record." "I know, but Richard legally filed his grievance mere hours before we officially registered the amendment. From a strictly technical standpoint, the moment his lawyers stamped that paperwork, the discrepancy was still legally binding." "Does that mean it's over? Did I lose?" "No, because our corrected deed effectively nukes his entire argument. But he's going to appeal the amendment. He's going to drag this out through every legal loophole in the book. And while he does, your property rights are frozen in a legal purgatory." "For how long?" "Months. Realistically, years." I collapsed into a kitchen chair, crushed beneath the sheer weight of it. Years. I didn't have years. I barely had enough runway to last a few months. The bank account was draining fast. My savings were practically non-existent. If Richard managed to stall this in court long enough, I would be forced into a fire sale just to survive, completely stripped of my choice. David was standing right there in the living room when I dropped the phone. He didn't offer any empty platitudes. He just stood there like a statue, giving me the space to process the brutal reality. "I can't beat him," I whispered, my voice finally cracking. "He's too dug in. He has endless money. He owns half the county government. And what exactly do you have?" I looked up at him, completely bewildered. "What are you talking about? What weapon do you hold that he doesn't?" I thought about it, really dug deep and thought, and the answer surfaced slowly but with absolute clarity. The truth. Then cock it and fire it. It was David who orchestrated the counteroffensive. He had a connection with the local district attorney, a guy named Michael, who had built a fierce reputation for prosecuting white-collar corruption and corporate bullying. David made the call, briefed him on the extortion, and asked him to put a magnifying glass on Richard Vance. Michael agreed to look into it, but he came with a harsh warning. The wheels of justice turn incredibly slow. I can't guarantee a damn thing, but it was a sliver of a chance, and a sliver was all I had left to cling to. Meanwhile, Thomas managed to ram our deed amendment through the system on an emergency basis, exploiting some obscure legal loophole Rachel had dug up. Richard's legal team filed an injunction against it that exact same afternoon. The entire conflict evolved into a grueling trench warfare of endless paperwork, filing deadlines, injunctions, and countersuits written in a language I couldn't comprehend. But the wind was shifting. I could feel it in my bones. Folks down at the general store started nodding at me again. Emily told me that Richard's loudmouth goons spreading rumors had magically disappeared from the county. Chloe called to say the city was suddenly buzzing with whispers about Richard Vance, horrific stories from other desperate farmers he had squeezed dry over the years. The truth was bleeding out. Drop by drop, it was flooding the streets. And then, on a bright Monday morning, Richard Vance showed up on my front porch. All by himself. No Vince, no Tyler, no hired muscle. Just him. Dressed in a sharp $1,000 suit despite the sweltering heat, radiating that suffocating arrogance of a man who has never been told no in his entire life. "I'm here to make you a final offer," he stated, cutting right to the chase. "I'm absolutely not interested. You haven't even let me name my price. I don't need to hear your price. My answer is a permanent no." He smiled, a razor-thin, bloodless smile. "You are making a catastrophic mistake, Sarah. I have the resources to keep this tied up in litigation for the rest of your natural life. I can make your daily existence a living hell, all according to the current market value. This farm is not for sale. It never was, and it never will be." He stood there, studying my face for a very long, uncomfortable minute. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Very well. You've made your bed." And he walked back to his truck. But this time around, I didn't feel a single ounce of fear. I felt a raging, white-hot fury. And fury, I was quickly learning, is a hell of a lot more useful than fear. Because fury makes you fight back. Michael, the district attorney, called my landline on a Wednesday afternoon. His tone was strictly professional and tightly controlled, but I could hear a crackle of electricity beneath it. "Sarah, I need you down at my office first thing tomorrow morning." Beneath it. "Sarah, I need you down at my office first thing tomorrow morning. Bring David with you." Did something break? It did, but we need to have this conversation behind closed doors. David drove me into the city the next morning. Michael's office was buried inside a crumbling municipal building downtown, reeking of old floor wax, with groaning staircases and a caged elevator that looked like a relic from the 30s. His personal office was incredibly Spartan, overwhelmed by towering stacks of legal briefs, dominated by a heavy oak desk with a single window overlooking the chaotic traffic below. He met us on his feet, offered a firm handshake, and didn't waste a second on small talk. I dug deep into Richard Vance's history, and I uncovered a glaring, repetitive pattern. My pulse spiked. What kind of pattern? Michael flipped open a thick manila folder and found a dozen documents across his desk. Richard has run this exact playbook before, 5 documented times in the last decade alone. It's the same predatory tactic every single time. He pinpoints a vulnerable plot of land he wants. He hunts down some obscure clerical error in the county deeds, and he financially asphyxiates the owner until they cave and sell for pennies on the dollar. In 2 of these cases, the families were completely bankrupted and lost everything. A cold knot tightened in my chest, and no one ever went to the police. They tried, but he retains a ruthless army of corporate lawyers. He's always managed to insulate himself from criminal liability, up until right now. What changed? Michael glanced at David, then locked eyes with me. You did. You refused to roll over, and your defiance emboldened his other victims to find. I have 3 sworn affidavits sitting right here from people who survived the exact same extortion racket you're fighting right now. With this ammunition, I can build a massive RICO case against him. I was completely speechless. I just stared blindly at the paperwork scattered across the oak wood, overcome by a violent cocktail of... I was completely speechless. I just stared blindly at the paperwork scattered across the oak wood, overcome by a violent cocktail of profound relief and blistering rage. Relief because I finally had proof I wasn't insane and I wasn't fighting this war alone. Rage because this predator could have been caged years ago. There is a major complication, however, Michael cut in. Richard is flooring the gas pedal. He's caught wind of the grand jury investigation. Yesterday afternoon, his lawyers filed a motion for an emergency injunction for possession of your farm, claiming you are actively destroying the property value. What does that translate to in plain English? It translates to him trying to legally seize your land and evict you before a judge even hears our case. If the judge grants the injunction, the sheriff's department will physically remove you from the premises. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. Is that even legal? He can certainly attempt it. And given the judges he's bought and paid for in this circuit, he has a terrifyingly high chance of succeeding. David slammed his palm flat against the desk, making the coffee mugs jump. Then we need to strike first, and we need to strike hard. Precisely my thought, Michael said, which is exactly why you're sitting in my office today. I need you to do something incredibly dangerous, Sarah. Name it. I need you to bait Richard into a private meeting, but this time, you're wearing a wire. The blood drained from my face. You want proves coercion, criminal threats, or extortion? I can use that audio to instantly nuke his eviction injunction, and it will be the final nail in the coffin for the federal case. I looked over at David. His jaw was clenched tight, his eyes dark with worry. That is a massive, life-threatening gamble, David muttered. I am well aware, Michael shot back, but it might be the only bullet we have left in the chamber. I sat there in dead silence, weighing my life. The sheer thought of being trapped in an isolated room with Richard Vance, knowing the monstrous things he was capable of, made me want to vomit. But the thought of getting dragged off my husband's land without throwing one last punch terrified me infinitely more. Wire me up, I said. Michael handed me a digital recorder the size of a Zippo lighter and gave me a crash course on how to operate it undetected. David didn't utter a single syllable for the entire hour-long drive back to the farm. It wasn't until we turned onto my dirt road that he finally cracked. You don't have to throw yourself to the wolves like this. I swear to God, we can figure out another angle. There are no other angles left, David. You know it, and I know it. He didn't say a word back, because he knew I was dead right. I set the trap for that Saturday. I swallowed my pride, called Richard's corporate office, and told his receptionist I was waving the white flag and wanted to hear his final buyout number. She sounded utterly shocked, but locked in the appointment, 2 o'clock sharp, out at his private estate. Chloe practically had a panic attack when I told her the plan. Auntie, this is completely suicidal. He could murder you out there and bury you under a patio. He's not going to lay a finger on me. It would bring down too much heat. The man is a psychopath, but he's a calculated one. And what if you're wrong? I didn't answer her, because honestly, I didn't know. Saturday afternoon, David chauffeured me out to Richard's massive compound. It was a sprawling, opulent estate, fortified by heavy wrought-iron gates, bristling with high-tech security cameras, centering around a modern mansion that looked like it belonged in Architectural Digest. David threw the truck in park right outside the main gate. "I'm dropping anchor right here. Things go sideways. You scream bloody murder. His security isn't going to let you pass this gate. I'm fully aware of that. That's exactly why I'm staying right here." I stepped out of the truck, the tiny recorder burning a hole deep inside my jeans pocket. My heart was thrashing so violently against my ribs, I thought I was going to pass out in the driveway. A massive security guard patted me down with his eyes, opened the gate, and escorted me up to the expansive back patio, where Richard was lounging in a teakwood chair, casually sipping from a steaming mug. "Sarah," he purred, flashing a shark's grin. "What a tremendously pleasant surprise. Please have a seat." I sat down stiffly. He offered to have the maid bring me coffee. I declined. He just sat there. Have we finally come to our senses regarding the sale of the farm? Not exactly. I came here to get some absolute clarity on your proposition. The proposition is incredibly straightforward. I write you a highly generous check for the acreage. You walk away completely debt-free, you avoid total financial ruin in court, and you eliminate this massive headache from your life permanently. And what exactly happens if I flatly refuse to sign the paperwork? He took a slow, agonizing sip from his mug. Then your life becomes exceptionally complicated. Litigation is a vicious, bleeding drain on finances. It takes years. It ruins your physical, and you are left completely destitute. So why not just surrender gracefully? Surrender gracefully for whose benefit? He smirked. For yours, for mine, for the greater good of progress. You've run this exact same extortion racket before, haven't you? You've crushed other families like this. His smirk instantly hardened into a concrete scowl. I've done what, exactly? You intimidated them. You terrorized them. You bled them dry in court until they completely shattered. Richard placed his mug onto the glass table with a terrifyingly slow, deliberate motion. His entire demeanor turned venomous. You need to be extremely careful with your words right now, Sarah. Flinging wild, baseless accusations will put you in a legal grave you will never, ever crawl out of. They aren't accusations. They are documented facts. He shot up out of his chair. He towered over me, his eyes practically vibrating with rage. You are making a fatal mistake. I went out of my way to be polite. I tried to do this the easy, civilized way, but if you want to be utterly destroyed, I will gladly obliterate you. I don't want a war. I just want you to leave me the hell alone. That is never going to happen. That dirt belongs to me. It always has. Your pathetic husband just lacked the spine to admit he was beaten. And I am going to break you until you admit the exact same thing. I stood up, slow and steady. That is never going to happen. That dirt belongs to me. It always has. Your pathetic husband just lacked the spine to admit he was beaten. And I am going to break you until you admit the exact same thing. I stood up, slow and steady, staring dead into his sociopathic eyes. Thank you for making everything so perfectly clear. I walked away. A triumphant grin spread across his face. The first time I had ever seen him smile. Oh, this will do nicely. This will do exceptionally well. Richard's emergency eviction injunction was thrown out of court immediately. The judge admitted the covert recording as hard evidence of criminal coercion and placed a total freeze on any property disputes until the grand jury concluded their investigation. Richard's high-priced lawyers tried to file a dozen different appeals, and every single one was laughed out of the room. And then, 2 weeks later, the hammer of God finally dropped. The district attorney's office officially indicted Richard Vance on federal RICO charges, citing a massive conspiracy of systemic economic extortion, criminal coercion, and fraudulent real estate acquisitions. Richard completely vanished from the county overnight, fled the state without a word to anyone, abandoning his crumbling empire to his panic-stricken legal team. And the floodgates opened. People couldn't stop talking. Horrific, heartbreaking stories that terrified families had kept buried for decades were suddenly front-page news. His very name became a toxic curse word in our town. Margaret evaporated too. The rumor mill said she had scuttled back to whatever dark corporate rock she had crawled out from under in the city, but nobody actually knew for sure. I didn't waste a second trying to find out. I never wanted to waste another brain cell thinking about that miserable woman. 3 months later, Richard was dragged back into the light. But he was a completely broken man. He was legally mandated to sit on a community land restitution committee, a humiliating public stipulation his lawyers had desperately brokered to keep him out of federal prison. The arrogant tyrant who had crushed and humiliated so many innocent families, was now forced to sit face to face with his victims and physically sign the very legal protections that secured the land he had tried to steal. I refused to attend the hearing, but David went, and he gave me the play-by-play. He looked entirely different, David noted, shrunken, like the air had been completely let out of his tires. Did you feel any pity for him? Not a single drop. I just felt cold, calm justice. The farm remained mine. The corrected deeds were ironclad and permanently filed, free from any historical discrepancies, completely immune to any future extortion. Rachel swore up and down that the property was legally bulletproof now. Thomas even drove out to hand-deliver the final stamped registry himself. Buster made a full, miraculous recovery. He's back on duty, fiercely patrolling the fence line every single morning, just like he always has. And me, I just slipped right back into my quiet routine, waking up before